campus where we try to promote civic literacy. And we believe one of the key hallmarks of a healthy democracy is media, and we've had a couple of events over the years on media, but I think it's been close to 4 years since we've had an event specifically on the media. So that'd be good to talk about some of the recent developments in the last 4 years in media. And I would remind you to look up on the Moraine Valley's YouTube, on the Moraine Valley Library's YouTube channel. They have a collection of our past events. They do a good job of curating that. Troy Swanson. And we've got 2 events called Blame It on the Media that were conducted, I think, in 2021. 2020, 2021. So urge you to go back and watch those as well. So today we're joined by a big panel. We have several faculty members and a couple of students as well who write for Velocity, the online student-led magazine. And so I thought each panel member could start by briefly introducing themselves, and we'll start on the end with Lisa.
I'm Lisa Couch. I teach journalism and communications.
Hello, everybody. My name is Sean Fye. I'm the political editor for Velocity.
Hey, everybody. I'm Phoebe Hodge, and I am the news editor for Velocity.
Hi, I'm Tish Hayes. I'm the information literacy librarian.
Good morning. My name is Troy Swanson. I'm the library department chair.
So I thought we'd start off talking about just the decline of newspapers and newsrooms, investigative journalism. Data shows that in 2025, we have about 1/3 of the newspapers that we did 20 years ago. And the majority of newspapers today are weekly, not daily. And there's many communities that lack a newspaper altogether. And this is from the Block Club Chicago, What Chicago is Losing in the Sun-Times by Clint Worthington. And he cited that Illinois has led the nation in newspaper job losses on a percentage basis over the last 2 decades, with 86% newspaper journalist jobs lost in the state, according to WBEZ report. So I thought we could talk about just the implications of this decline of legacy media, the media that we traditionally look at as newspapers and broadcast, print media, and potential consequences on democracy.
Yeah, I'm actually married to a former journalist who was a columnist for the Chicago Sun-Times for 13 years. And he left the Sun-Times in 2009. When he started there, the circulation of the Sun-Times was 500,000, and now it's down to about 100,000. And now this Block Club story is kind of about some of the key people, additional people who have left the Sun-Times. Some of the bigger names like Michael Sneed, who had the nickname Queen of Scoops, because she had a 58-year career in journalism, and she broke news about world figures ranging from Fidel Castro to Hillary Clinton. So you lose, people like Michael Sneed. Richard Roper was really well known for movie reviews and other key journalists that have left, and so that's kind of the latest in the decline of the newspaper itself. I had to laugh because I was looking back to see when my husband, Greg Couch, had left the Sun-Times, and he was quoted as saying that he was leaving because he felt like that the paper was holding on by a thread at that time, in 2009. And he was going to AOL to work for AOL Fan House as a sports writer, which just seems funny now that that was the move, to something more current. But we've seen a lot of drop in newspapers, and what that means is a loss of original reporting in a lot of cases, and that's kind of the basis of everybody else's information. John Oliver had a last week tonight with John Oliver episode back in 2016 where he talked about how the media is a food chain that would fall apart without local newspapers, because what happens is the newspaper reporters would be the ones doing the hard work of actually getting out there and reporting, getting out there, interviewing people, being on the ground, being in person at things, and then their information would be, sucked up by other media outlets and aggregated or put out again over social media or over, cited on TV news. And so when you lose newspapers, you're not just losing newspapers. Of course, newspapers still exist, and not necessarily as much in the paper form, but in, online, and they're still doing some really good reporting. There's a lot of implications to that when local news doesn't get covered, when people aren't really delving into things.
I think especially like with the rise of this new media, or these people that are kind of being substituted for what had traditionally been news media outlets, I think we're seeing a big rise in podcasts. And I think one of the detriments of that is that we have a lot of these like fake experts almost who are like claiming to be very well versed in whatever topic they're doing their podcast on. And I think that with that there comes, more trust in that than what was traditionally media outlets. And it's kind of funny because actually Pew Research just did a survey of why people listen to podcasts. And around 29% of the people who were surveyed listened to podcasts to stay up to date on current events, which I kind of thought was really interesting. And only 1 in 5 of those people were actually listening to podcasts that were connected to news organizations, which I think is very telling of kind of where we are as a society, and how we're kind of approaching the news, I guess, now more so than ever.
I'll jump in. To go back, I think good points from Phoebe and Lisa. The thing that we learned with the rise of the internet, what we learned about legacy media, especially newspapers, is that people don't make a lot of money off the news, is the irony, right? Newspapers made a lot of money when they had the news, but they also had classified ads, and they had sports, and they had the cartoon page. And you had this thing that was bundled together that got delivered to your house that a lot of people read for a lot of different reasons. Like some people never read the business section, some people never read the book section. But if you had a Sunday Tribune or a subscription to the Sun-Times, you got all that together. And the way that they could make money is that it all got swept up together and we were all willing to pay for it, and then that money went and supplemented everything. Now what has happened is as that funding source has been ripped apart, we've realized it's harder and harder to make money off of those pieces individually. And the people who are making money are the really broad monster sites that can cover the country, really across the country. So New York Times has become profitable, and it's partly become profitable because it doesn't just cover New York. It really has become the national newspaper in a lot of ways, and probably has almost as many subscribers in Illinois as the Sun-Times or the Tribune. Maybe not quite, but pretty close, right? And that's how they make their go of it. I would say there's some really interesting innovations that we're not sure if they're going to work, and one of them is the Sun-Times. So Chicago Public Media owns WBEZ and the local NPR station for Chicago. It purchased the Sun-Times and is trying to do a nonprofit model of the news. So you can still subscribe and get the paper delivered to your house, but they're also asking you to donate to keep it going. So the Sun-Times articles are free. You can make a donation, you can sign up for an account, and that way they're trying to keep it afloat, how NPR does. So every so often on the radio on NPR, there's a pledge drive. People pay so much a year, and it's free news for everybody. But what we're seeing is that experiment does not seem to be going well, unfortunately. Like this week or last week, again, those layoffs at the Sun-Times is showing, hey, we're not making the money that we thought we were going to make. A lot of the layoffs are really buyouts, so people that were on the verge of retirement, we're going to give you a sweet deal. You're going to leave, and we're going to give you this deal, and then we're not going to replace you. And that's a big chunk of what those are. And so that's something that should worry all of us. There are some interesting local things, just to throw some of this in. The site called The Tribe, that's TRIIBE, focuses, it's entirely digital. It is on-the-ground reporting focused on African-American issues, so they're trying to find kind of a niche market that they can cover and grow subscribers. We're seeing like the Chicago Reader, which is the longest existing free newspaper in the United States. You used to be able to walk by every corner in Chicago and grab a copy of the Reader. I think you still can get it sometimes. They're like now employee owned. They went nonprofit. And so there's like the union bought them out, and they're trying to keep afloat. We're seeing things like CityCast Chicago, which is a podcast, daily podcast, covers a lot of diverse issues. They do a really nice job. But again, they're not doing necessarily reporting, as you had mentioned, Lisa. They're kind of interviewing people who do the reporting, that kind of podcast side. So I think there's some really exciting. Block Club Chicago may be the best example of new innovation success, where they're doing like neighborhood by neighborhood reporting and then trying to ask for donations. So we're in this era of innovation and experimentation that I think is exciting. And I think it is exciting that Chicago is one of the leading kind of environments to test things out. But I'm also really nervous that some of the tests don't seem to be going as well as a lot of us would hope. So there was problems with the legacy media, a lot of problems with these big gatekeepers. It was hard to get into the Sun-Times. It was hard to be noticed by the Tribune, and they ignored a whole lot of things, a whole lot of problems. But once they're ripped apart, I don't know that the replacements have been as healthy. With the rise of the internet, we all thought, the democracy of information. But the reality is good information takes people who can make a living at it. And to make a good living at it, you have to get paid somehow. And that funding model, that business model has not hit yet that we can figure out how to do good local news. And I'll pause there for that.
Maybe just to follow up a little bit, Phoebe had mentioned the fake experts, really no credentials for some of the people who might be running a podcast or being an influencer on social media. In contrasting that with maybe some of the journalists, the traditional gatekeepers, as Troy mentioned, who may have worked for the legacy media. I'm thinking of like back in my day, the major anchors on the broadcast networks, like on ABC, CBS, and NBC. Like their background, their training, their credentials, the way that they go about reporting on the news, and those in the print media as well, like how might that be different than some of these people without that training that might be in the newer forms of media that do podcasts or that do social media?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. I think we have to remember there's pros and cons to the rise of citizen journalism. That encompasses a lot of things, including things on social media and podcasting, and that democratization of anybody can have access to an audience via the internet. So there's benefits to that, and definitely to diversify the voices. But there are definite drawbacks as well, because I think we need to recognize that journalism is a profession, and it requires good training. It requires experience and a basis in journalistic ethics, journalistic responsibility. Even here at Moraine Valley, my students in my Journalism 101 class, some of whom are here today, are thinking about some of these issues, and they're thinking them through, critical thinking skills, and they're learning about journalistic ethics, and they're learning about news values and news judgment, and they're learning about some of the economic forces at work in the industry. In my Journalism 111 class, my media writing class, they're learning how to report information credibly, the importance of getting more than one source on something, and to verify information and get different perspectives on things, how to interview people and quote them accurately. In my student publications class, the students are working on putting out the magazine Velocity. These two are two of our editors, and they've been trained, and they're continuing to be trained and they're encountering ethical issues and how do we deal with, conflict of interest and all of those things. So I bring that up because this is what's happening here, and many of my students are going on to major in journalism at four-year schools, and they're getting that training, and they're thinking through some of these issues. Citizen journalists haven't necessarily done that. And so they may rush to post a video of something without any context or without obtaining verification of information. And, we have these so-called experts that go on podcasts and may not really be experts and credible sources. And so I think, we have to have a regard for journalism as a profession and that it does have a code of ethics.
Tish, you wanna jump?
Yeah, just kind of to speak to this, like this shift in the way we kind of both consume journalism or consume news and media. As you were talking, I was thinking about the conversations the panelists had a little bit about news influencers. And we know that I think it's half of adults in America get their news from social media. So that is a place where people go, not necessarily to look for information or to look for news, but it exists there, and so we encounter it. And so on one side, there is the need for journalists and people who have been trained to produce that content that then isn't paid for when we put it on social media. And so there's this tension, I think, between the need for profit and the need to create an audience and the need for the financial support of good journalism and just the reality that so much of it isn't paid for. And we are in an environment now, I think, Kevin, you mentioned this, we're just really used to not having to pay for things. And because there isn't government support, there isn't there isn't a lot of support outside of our individual contributions, it makes it very complicated. And I had a point that I was going towards that I'm missing now. But I think it then makes it incumbent upon all of us then to have to sort through and make sense of what is the environment that we're in and the information that we're looking at, which I think makes us do a lot more work. I feel like we pay for bad information in one way or another, and we pay for good information in one way or the other. I'll leave it there. But I think we need a shift in the way we're thinking about both how we consume and how we support the people who are creating good content out there.
Yeah. So what we're really seeing now with the rise of online political commentators is that reporting has become very spread out, and you have people on live streaming platforms such as Twitch and Rumble where a lot of young people get their news from, TikTok as well for the short form content, and then you have YouTube now, which traditionally is the videos, 10 to 15 minutes, video essays, but now has also gone into the short form stuff. And then podcasts. A lot of young people, young men are drawn to podcasts like the Joe Rogan Experience. And when Phoebe is talking about these fake experts, you have people who utilize these platforms who are kind of influencing people and the information that they consume. And it really becomes a free-for-all at times. Who can say the most sensationalist thing, who can say the wildest thing to get the most views, which on the back turn can turn into money, into monetization, and it kind of feeds into this thing where, at least I feel like, where people on different sides of the political spectrum are kind of living in completely separate realities and worlds depending on where they get their information from.
And if I could, did you want to jump in, Phoebe?
Oh yeah, sure. I also think that with that and with the rise of podcasts and stuff, I think that's also though can be a great benefit for these journalists, and I think that this is actually going to create a whole new space for them. And I think that because it's there, I think we're going to start seeing more of a shift in journalism, and I think that more publications are going to have podcasts, more publications are going to try to reach people through that, and I think that could be definitely a positive, at least for news outlets, staying as a good source of information. So I think there's a positive there too, with new media.
Maybe I would just offer a contrast from legacy media in terms of what we've lost a little bit, and I think a local example. So I have attended many Moraine Valley Board of Trustees meetings. They're very exciting. You can watch them online. I have done this for the last 10 years. There's been almost zero reporters from the media there, which in the 80s and 90s, there would have absolutely been a reporter from the Daily Southtown at our meetings watching, right? So if you walk in, and we have 7 trustees, so we're a big school, 1,200 employees, 15,000 students, give or take, multi-million-dollar budget that impacts 26 suburbs across the country. So a big institution that seems like the public would want to know what's going on, right? Right now, the #1 source of information about Moraine Valley Community College is the Public Relations Office of Moraine Valley Community College putting out things on their website. And now, let me just say, we have the most ethical leaders. We have so many accountability, we are above board, and I'm very proud of the work that we do at Moraine. So let me just put that disclaimer out there first. Don't want to leave any insinuations. But if you walk in and look at our Board of Trustees, we would have a reporter who would have been there every week. And most of us wouldn't recognize, I recognize because I've gone there many times, the different communities that each of those people are from, right? So there's a trustee that was put there basically by Worth Township. Worth Township elected this person, is a leader in Worth Township. Is there someone from Orland Township, someone from Blue Island, someone from Oak Lawn? All of them cooperate together, run across our district, are connected to other political groups across the Southland and across Chicagoland and the state of Illinois. A group of people that are good advocates for us, but also have deep political ties historically across our area. But if any of us just walked in and didn't know that, you just see a bunch of people up there voting yes or no on budgets, right? But a reporter from the Southtown who would have gone to every meeting, who would have watched elections, who would have seen people come up through political organizations, see people win and lose. They have this whole different context around what happens at a simple board meeting at the local community college, right? And this is happening at every high school district, every elementary school district, every library board, every village board. There would have been reporters that would have been there covering and watching and knowing and seeing these connections and asking questions, and importantly, watching the evolution of projects and buildings and taxes over many, many years, right? And when someone else couldn't be there, someone new would fill in and they would do a handoff. And they would be there to ask the questions, oh, well, you're voting on this, but what about 4 years ago when you chose not to do this? Why are you doing it now? In the era of citizen journalists, when no one is there and no one is watching, this is where you get some of the things that happen. So for instance, in Dalton, Illinois, in the south suburbs, there's just a new election, a new mayor, but evidence of heavy corruption. A former mayor using village money to buy cars, perhaps. I don't want to exactly say what's happening, but the FBI is investigating, and so we will know more and more, right? But some of this stuff might have been prevented if there would have been a reporter there asking questions, asking why you're approving this, asking who you're connected to on that board. And all of that in 20 years has literally vanished. And now there's a few reporters. If the reporters know there's going to be a big fight and juicy news, they will show up. If it's just the kind of day-to-day operations, no one is there, no one is watching. And that's the stuff that worries me about the demise of local media. And I think there's some great things about podcasts. I listen to tons of podcasts. There's some great experiments happening, but nothing yet has replaced the on-the-ground observations of local journalists. And so that's a loss that we're still trying to overcome.
Yeah, Kevin, if I may, I think this kind of goes back to the idea of if it's not traditional media, if it's not legacy media and the media that's been trusted for decades, then who are now the watchdogs? Who is the Fourth Estate? And for people who may be unfamiliar, essentially, who are the watchdogs, the Fourth Estate? It refers to the media and journalists who are supposed to monitor the government, people, groups, and hold them accountable on behalf of the public. It's something that's supposed to be a benefit for society, keep society and politics, government properly functioning, minimize corruption, and it sort of operates under this premise that the public is entitled to a sense and degree of transparency in regards to the people and the entities that make decisions that affect their lives. And that if the government or whoever it may be is lying to the people, manipulating them, that the media is there as a contrast, that they are the reliable ones, the trustworthy ones. So it kind of just leads to the question that if that has been eroded, if legacy media, traditional media, if they're supposed to be the watchdogs, and that's no longer the case, then I guess who sort of fills that vacancy? And really, nobody has the training that that journalists, experienced journalists, do. Nobody really has their expertise and the experience that they have.
Yeah. I was actually one of those reporters. One of my first jobs out of college was in South Carolina. I covered county government and coastal environment. And one of the things I remember was that every time there was going to be a new development, there were major issues in terms of like beach erosion and environmental impacts of things. But I remember one of the county government, one of the county council members was this little old lady, blue-haired lady, that would draw on her eyebrows every day, and one of them was always a little higher than the other, so she had this kind of quizzical look on her face, but that just sticks in my mind. But she was always interested in, you know, whether there'd been a tree survey done anytime there was going to be something built, and I'm like, there's lots of trees, but good for her. But you know, what we have now is what's called news deserts, where in a lot of local communities, we don't have those local reporters, and that's what's happening. And another example, in Bell, California, when the local newspaper there shut down, elected officials just kept voting themselves pay raises to the point where the city manager was making $800,000. Just because nobody was watching. Wow. So that watchdog role is hugely important, and you know, we have to remember that the government's business is our business. And so if we're going to know what's happening, and there are a lot of things happening, especially these days, we have to have a responsible free press that's able to cover these things at all levels, from the local, from the Moraine Valley Board of Trustees and the local county government, all the way up to national and international things that are happening. So, you know, at the same time, we have a president who has defined the news media as the enemy of the people. So think about that. Like, the news media is not the enemy of the people. The news media is the eyes and ears of the people and the voice of the people. And this is our business, and we should know what's happening. So that watchdog role is hugely important. You know, we have a timely example here of some of the stuff that's going on. You know, when we did our Blame It on the Media panel, Tish and I were on Zoom together during kind of post-lockdown, and I was talking from a corner of my bedroom on my little laptop. But anyway, one of the things we talked about was identity politics, and how when reporters are acting as that watchdog role, that and convey information that puts your candidate or your person in a negative light, or is critical of someone, you know, that you voted for, that feels like an attack on you. And so then that makes us less ready to believe things that may be factual, just because it feels like such a personal attack. And so I think that sometimes those in government will actually use that against us, and will double down on this idea that there is this you know, decline in trust of the news media and of sources of information, and will you know, then attack the messenger. So the recent situation with Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth and the inclusion of the Atlantic editor-in-chief in this series of texts about attacks on Yemen. When Hegseth was confronted about it, he attacked the Atlantic editor, Jeffrey Goldberg, calling him a deceitful and highly discredited so-called journalist who's made a profession of peddling hoaxes time and time again. I mean, the texts were there in black and white. Hegseth published the texts. And so, but I think politicians sometimes know that because we have this tendency to distrust, blame it on the media, that they can blame it on the media, and people will go along with that and not question that and not, look at the facts in front of them sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, +1 to all of that, yes. And I think, as you were talking, and I just kept thinking about how, when we did the Blame It on the Media event 4 years ago, we were talking about how, like, the landscape then, and I think the landscape now for news and information, like, it has been in development. Like, we didn't just arrive here suddenly. Like, we didn't just end up in this place where, like, people don't trust the media, or we have these, like, really fractured media systems. Like, this has been, like, decades in the making, and there's all kinds of reasons behind that. And, like, a big component of that is that when we think about the media as, like, the watchdogs, like, we have a government and we have a corporate system, I would say, not to be conspiratorial, but we do have people whose it's in their best interest to discredit the media, and we've seen that happen since, like, very deliberately in 2016 when Trump was talking about fake news and discrediting accurate reporting, to all kinds of other ways that we have been asked to, like, not believe the things that we see in front of us, but instead, like, take the truths the way people have told them to us. And so I think that distrust that has been built over, in some cases, decades for some of us, right? Like, it makes it difficult to, like, arrive at this news landscape and say, okay, yeah, the New York Times is great, and I am going to trust everything they say, and, like, because I don't think that is even true now. So, like, we, again, coming back to this idea, like, as consumers, we have to be much more critical. And I think because the news media has been deliberately, I think, discredited over the last few decades, we, I think, have to rethink, like, what does legacy media do? How do we support it? And how do we hold media accountable, as well as our government officials who are who have put us in this position in the first place?
Just to echo a little bit of what Tish was talking about, distrust in the media has been something that has been growing for decades. It was not something that magically appeared a couple years ago or in 2016. It's been steadily on the downturn since the mid-1970s, and this is data from Gallup. But what we do see is that it starts taking a sharper downturn in the mid-1990s, and then especially in 2016, which was the year that Donald Trump ran his presidential campaign, won the presidency. And so if we look at the data from Gallup, it more so appears that Donald Trump exploited a problem and a feeling that was growing in Americans and in the country for decades, and he capitalized on that rather than creating it himself.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about today's college students and how old you were in 2016, and when the term fake news was so popularized. How old were you?
I think like 6th grade for me, which
Yeah.
is crazy to think about how far we've come.
Yeah, so I mean, you came of age in
Yeah.
this era of fake news,
Yeah,
right? That's
crazy.
what, you all have come of age in this time period. And so to think, like, you don't necessarily remember a time before that. And that kind of blows my mind sometimes too, especially with how long I've been teaching. But yeah, I mean, you know, what Sean was saying about this isn't a new thing, it goes back to, and I mentioned, you know, Trump talking about the news media as an enemy of the people, but he wasn't the first to say that. It was actually Nixon who said that first. And you have, I think it's kind of interesting, so, you know, the only profession that's mentioned in the Constitution is free press. It's that important to our democracy. And so, but Nixon decided to very deliberately try to rename it the media as opposed to the press, because it had connotations of being more manipulative, of being less trustworthy, of being less part of who we are as a country than the press. So it's just kind of interesting that it, you know, it started back then. But this watchdog role, it comes back to the fact that journalists do operate by a code of ethics. And the Society of Professional Journalists, one of the things that it states in its code of ethics is that journalists should be vigilant and courageous about holding those with power accountable and should give voice to the voiceless. So that's a central part of, you know, what journalism is all about. That isn't, again, one of those things that necessarily podcasters are about. Maybe they are. You know, sometimes I think they are giving voice to the voiceless. Social media, that democratization that's happening, is giving more voices platforms. But you know, being vigilant and courageous about holding those with power accountable requires a lot of legwork. It requires going to Board of Trustees meetings, which sometimes are not that interesting. But something interesting might happen, and then you got to be there if it does, and you've got to ask questions, and you've got to ask other people questions, and look at the impact, and really examine these issues. And that's what journalism is all about. And there's still absolutely a need for that and a place for it in our country, despite some of the decline of legacy media or newspapers. Something's coming that's going to fill this void. And I think, you know, the fact that journalism as a profession is being attacked these days is actually a sign that it's still powerful. And so we're, you know, in a bad moment right now, and we're trying to figure out kind of what journalism is going to morph into, and how it's going to make a profit, how it's going to still keep its ethics and its relevance. But clearly it still matters, and it's still important, and it may be more important than ever that we stay informed about all the things that are happening, because things are happening fast. You know, it's important.
Kind of going along with that, I actually just saw a great quote from NPR, actually, and it was talking about how the media functions as a, quote, misinformation scarecrow. And there's evidence that the very existence of media in a community acts as a deterrent for those who are looking to stretch the law or distort the truth. And I think right now, I mean, we have a president who has, you know, threatened to suspend the licenses of several different media outlets, such as ABC, CBS, and NBC News. And I think that this mistrust that we're talking about has been formulated kind of just based on the rhetoric that Trump and other presidents have used, like buzzwords like fake news. I think that that's really kind of warping the perception that citizens have of, you know, these news outlets and these media organizations, like, in their own mind. And, you know, I think that, you know, the FCC right now is actually investigating quite a few different media outlets. And, I mean, the Associated Press was just banned from the press pool, which I think that alone is a really, like, pretty direct attack on freedom of the press, because, you know, if our president doesn't want certain people covering him or covering what's going on in the White House, I think that says a lot about that. Oh, you know, he doesn't want a scarecrow. He doesn't want the people to know. Like, that's what I feel like it kind of is saying to a lot of citizens, and I think that's also kind of, then again, causing that mistrust.
And just to add into that, why was the AP banned from the press pool?
I think it was because of the Gulf of America thing, where they didn't want to refer to the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America, which I think that's kind of crazy, and that's freedom of speech in itself.
Right. So just to connect maybe a few dots here, and then we'll open it up here in a little bit. We have some other questions that we wanted to get to too, but we also want to make sure that we can get to some of the audience questions. So the watchdog, the press is kind of the fourth branch of government, a check and balance. I was wondering, like on Inauguration Day, to see like who had the plum spots behind the president on Inauguration Day. It was some of the people who lead the information economy, the tech leaders, and of course Trump's biggest donor, Elon Musk, and the owner of X. That seems to recognize that he understands the power of the media and the people who provide information and the attention economy. And then I guess I'm just trying to add in here that it's unique that we have a president who has his own media, Truth Social, and apparently his media outlets are $2 billion or more of that he owns himself, or that he is going to potentially stand to gain when he sells this. So I guess just to add more into this press or the media as a check and balance, like what are some of those challenges in this era where there seems to be some of these biggest tech leaders who own the platforms that so many people, including young people, are getting their information, are donating to the president's campaign, or there's this kind of symbiotic relationship between them? Any of you like to chime in on that?
So when we have people like Elon Musk, who owns X and recently sold X to his AI company, XAI, people like Mark Zuckerberg, who own Meta, a lot of people get their information from X, or a lot of people still call it Twitter, Facebook. A lot of older people get their information from Twitter. When you have people like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg front row at the inauguration of Donald Trump, I feel like that makes their intentions kind of clear. And if they are the ones in control of where we're getting our information, you really have to approach things with a degree of skepticism that people may have never really had to have before, at least on this sort of level. You really have to question everything you see, and as a civilian and as a consumer of news, you have to do everything in your power to verify the information that you are consuming, and kind of getting that out there.
I think it's important to look at the information, the distribution infrastructure of news. So if we go pre-internet, a newspaper would show up in your driveway. I'd run out and get it, give it to my dad. He would look at the front page, my mom, get to an article, right? That's how you got to an article, is you would sift through all these other articles and you'd get to it, right? Internet's invented. The number one way you get to an article is you would go to the New York Times homepage, you would click, and you'd find the article. Then all of a sudden, when they were looking at web traffic, the number one way people got to the article was from Google News, or just Google, right? So now any advertising that you had on the homepage is gone. Like, you're not making that money because they're skipping your website's homepage and going directly to the articles. So now you have Google and Google News as your intermediary to get to that. Then you move a little bit further down, okay, probably getting to the time when you all were born, and then you start to have social media. And the number one avenue to articles is Facebook and Twitter. And I think X and Facebook still remain toward the top of getting to the actual articles. And that's if people are actually reading the articles and not just listening to influencers and summaries and podcasts of the articles, right? But what you then have with Zuckerberg and, oh my God, what's his name? Musk, is they start to become the publishers. they are determining what you see based on the algorithm. And that for a little while it was very political, and they're like, hey, this is too political, too hot. So what do they do on Facebook? They turn down the algorithm so you're seeing less news because they wanted to steer away from the controversy. And so they are controlling and influencing. And again, it's more complicated than that. People seek out their own stuff. I don't want to reduce it down to like, there are these like guys that are just like pushing these buttons that control everything. They don't control everything. People still find their way. But they absolutely have influence, and they absolutely have control over how that information flows. And that goes back to some of these ideas I was mentioning earlier about how you make money, how you pay for journalists, because you're not seeing this like click through. So one of the best things you could do is become a subscriber, download the app of that source, whatever it is, and click through all their things and take the middlemen out of your news consumption, right? And go directly to the reporting and to the sources. So I think that's the thing we don't see. They are essentially the new publishers of information we're putting their fingers on the scale on how we get to the sources that we read.
Yeah, I think as far as like how we approach this as consumers, an interesting thing might be to actually look up the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. It's a one-page thing with all these bullet points. And think about whether your sources of information are following those ethical guidelines. One of them is, avoiding conflict of interest, which clearly is not happening with some of these owners. And, down to like, I mean, when my husband would be covering the Super Bowl or something, friends would always ask me, oh, do you get to go too? Can you get you tickets? I'm like, no. He can't accept things for his family. That's a conflict of interest. And so, we talk about those kinds of things even in my journalism classes. No, we don't interview members of our own family. We, try not to interview our best friend for stories because there's a tendency to not be able to maintain that objectivity. But so, I think looking at that code of ethics is a good kind of start to seeing, evaluating your sources of information. It does take a lot more work for us, though. And we've talked about gatekeepers. We used to have editors that, would kind of help determine what was newsworthy, what would go on the front page, what would lead the newscast. And that had its pros and cons, but it took some of that work out of it for us to an extent. One of the things I do in my Journalism 101 class is I give students all the headlines from like 5 different newspapers for the day and have them use their news judgment to decide what would go on their front page. And it takes them, the whole class period to think about that and really think it through. So we have all this information at our fingertips, and yet we're less informed, I think, in a lot of ways.
To touch on the editor idea, there's an idea called mechanisms of accountability. And so we talked about the reporting and the importance of being on the ground and knowing the history and knowing the people. But also along with that came these editors where by the time a story got to you, it had gone through the hands of at least 3 other people, sometimes more depending on what it was. And those people are fact-checking, so they're confirming quotes. They are doing things like copy editing, making sure there's no errors, but also looking at the overall reporting and checking on making sure there's no plagiarism, that this isn't made up. And then at most major newspapers, they had and I think it's the greatest thing, the idea of the public desk, or an ombudsman. And those are the people, they were paid to represent us, to represent the readers. And their job was to check for any bias. Their job was to check for those errors, that make sure no one's getting paid off to put a story through. And their whole job was like an internal fact-checking mechanism to add to the credibility. So if a story got through, it had to get through all of these hurdles, so you knew if it was New York Times, Tribune, Sun-Times, that these were strongly sourced, well-supported articles. It wasn't that they're always perfect. There's famous examples. The Spanish Civil War, where you had like Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst basically started a war with Spain that we got into, right? So there's a lot of great examples of the failure of the media, so we should not glorify too much. But there were also these systems that existed that have largely been eroded away. The New York Times closed their public desk in 2018 or 19 due to they were worried about funding, so they got rid of the whole job. It doesn't exist anymore. So that was, to me, a symbolic moment of change to one of the greatest newspapers in our country, in the world, really. So it's shifting for sure. But just to get back, even in existing those media outlets, there's still those editorial steps where it's not just you're a reporter and you get to say whatever you want. No, there's checks on you to make sure that you're doing the job right.
That's happening with Velocity. We have layers of editors, and things are submitted by a writer, and they go through editors. Everything gets at least 2 other pairs of eyes on it before it gets published. So, it's different than being able to just post something directly to social media.
Yeah, and I think also like that role of the consumer that we were just talking about is I think it's just because of the shift in how much information we have. I think it is kind of like Sean was saying earlier, it's important to be a savvy consumer, I guess, of the news that you intake, because there are so many sources out there, and there are some that are not credible. It's so funny because like 2 days ago, I was in classroom 1 learning how to like find credible sources for my College 101 class. But I think, though, that's the price that we have to pay, like, as consumers in an age where we have, this endless amount of information. So, but I also think there's a fine line with, being a savvy consumer and kind of being ignorant to factual news just because you don't want to believe it, I guess. So I think that, like, with that in mind of how many people are checking, editors, how many editors are checking all of these different stories before they go out. So I think you also have to keep that in mind, as well as that, these aren't just, not being checked at all. So I think that's important, to understand as consumers of media.
Yeah, I think that the idea of being a skeptical consumer or like a critical consumer is really important. And I remember in 2016 when we first had like kind of the rise of like fake news and that in media and news being like tagged that way, I feel like there was a lot more, or I heard from students in College 101 classes and other classes, like a real distrust of news. Like news was like I don't even want to engage with it because it's so bad. And I think we've shifted culturally. We understand that like fake news with a little bit more nuance, and we know that news isn't necessarily fake or bad. But I do think it, like that, putting the onus on the consumer is, yes, we need skills to do that. We need to be evaluating. And I find it very frustrating because at the same time that we have this shift in media where we have to be more watchful, where we have fewer editors doing those kinds of jobs, where legacy media is just deeply underfunded in all kinds of ways. We also are underfunding librarians in our K through 12 institutions. We have, and higher ed, yes, absolutely. And we have an attention economy that like really values and prizes like, whatever's going to catch your eye. And we have media, including some news outlets, who will absolutely not like shy away from putting out the most outrageous version of an event, even if it's true, the version that's going to catch your eye and like force you to engage with something that doesn't necessarily give you all of the context or facts. And so like given the environment that we're in, I think we put a lot of, I think, blame on people who don't engage with the news or don't engage with media, and I always like try to shy away from that. Like there are real reasons, I think, why people try to avoid those engagements because it's difficult. And I think, as a librarian, as someone who is really committed to like supporting people as they evaluate information, want to find ways to make sure that we're not also shaming people for stepping away when we can see how institutions and like so much of the environment we're in is creating the situation that we're finding ourselves in. It's not necessarily the individuals. It's these bigger shifts and bigger, I think, forces that we're contending with.
There are other questions, but I should open it up to the audience to see if there's questions or comments that you would like the panel members to address. I think I'll just repeat it.
One at a time, please.
Well, feel free, if you have one, to raise your hand. In the meantime, I was just thinking about going back to something I think Sean had started several minutes ago about just some of the different social media outlets, and just thinking about how fractured this is, where, again, once upon a time when when coming of age, there was kind of the three major broadcast news networks and handful of newspapers, for the most part, that many Americans learned about what was going on in the world and in America and in their communities. Whereas today, there seems to be a much more kind of splintered media environment. And even if all of us got on our phones and went on to one social media outlet, let's say TikTok, we might have we would likely have very different content. And there's benefits and drawbacks to this, but I just, wanted to kind of see what your thoughts were of, in this era of the decline of newspapers and rise of new media, including social media. It appears that, polarization politically has taken off during the same time period. Not trying to say that this caused it, but, what are some of the benefits or drawbacks as you see it, especially for our two student panel members who, write for the velocity, and you're aware of like the consumption patterns of your peers?
I think that a lot of times, because we have social media, we're seeing like little snippets of stuff. I think especially like with TikTok, I think it's harder for us to kind of get the full story on stuff, because we're watching, 15-second videos, and sometimes they are coming from, news organizations. Like you see, the New York Times has a TikTok. All these different, outlets have TikToks, but they'll show like a tiny little snippet of the story, trying to get you to read that story. And people are just not clicking on the full story. They're just reading that one little snippet. Like I just saw the other day, like, asteroid coming to Earth 2025. And then it's like, click the link in our bio. Right. But like, how many people are clicking that link? How many teenagers are engaging with that? Instead of like just taking it at face value. At least in my experience, I have, seen a lot of that stuff of like, I'll see like a 15-second clip of a story, and then I won't go to, whatever they're researching on, because you're scrolling and you're scrolling. And I think that can be said about a lot of, different platforms, not just TikTok, but, Instagram and all that kind of stuff. So
I think depending on what platforms you're getting your information from, excuse me, the algorithm is designed to feed you the stuff that you like, and when that's the case, you kind of start getting in your own little echo chamber, and you're consuming the same sort of rhetoric over and over and over again. Whereas if you sit down and pull up a newspaper, magazine, website, you have access to all sorts of different viewpoints, topics. But if you're only getting your information on Instagram, X/Twitter, TikTok, the algorithm is going to keep feeding you stuff that you interact with the most.
Yeah, I guess just to follow up, it's giving you what you want, maybe not necessarily what you need. And, I think you two really stand out to me as somebody who's been teaching for 20 years, people who are very informed about media and understanding journalism well. And so at least, Phoebe, you're getting that 15-second snippet of the New York Times, whereas I wonder how many of your peers are even getting any of that, let's call it hard news, or content that might be being recycled from the original reporters like from the New York Times, whereas, you know, I'm not trying to be dismissive, but I think you know, maybe you, like, do you think that you are representative of, you know, your peers and the type of content that you are even getting on your feeds?
Yeah, I think that's kind of hard to say, just because, you know, being so immersed in, you know, journalism classes and all that kind of stuff, that probably changes my algorithm too, you know, for research purposes. But I don't know a lot of people who, when they need news or when they are looking for information on stuff, that they go to, you know, the New York Times. I don't know a lot of people like that. I think a lot of people, because, you know, TikTok, people can post whatever they want. I think a lot of people do go to TikTok, and that's why I think people were so afraid when it got shut down, is because you're getting a lot of times, you know, kind of unfiltered stuff. So people are thinking like a lot of this, you know, is, I guess, news. But yeah, I don't think people are going to, you know, these news outlets. I think people are primarily searching on TikTok for, you know, whatever they're looking for, I guess.
There was a Pew Research study, I think from last year, and I think so 50% of TikTok users get news, but it's not intentional. So they're not like subscribing, they're not following news. It's just like the algorithm brings them news. And so I feel like in some ways that's amazing. Like when I was 18, I was not like you all. Like my 18 to 25, I did not seek out news ever. And because social media did not exist, the internet was barely around, like I just kind of knew what was happening because like I would, you know, see a headline on the New York Times. So I was very uninformed about what was happening in the like mid 90s in the rest of the world outside of like my very narrow scope. So in some ways, I feel like young people have the opportunity to be much more informed. And we now also, I think, especially with TikTok, depending on your interests, you're getting not just like the New York Times perspective, but you're probably getting like international perspectives. You're getting perspectives from people whose voices were not available in media before now. So marginalized communities have much more access to like creating content. So like on one hand, there are so many problems with TikTok and like in social media and getting our news there. But on the other hand, there is this just incredible amount of information that we never had access to before. And I do think it changes then our ability to be informed about the world and like the people in the world. And some of that then goes like, what do you do with that, right? Do you ignore it? Do you seek it, like do more to seek it out? Do you follow it up? Like we all take in tons of information, like what do we do with that information? I think is like, to me, maybe an important second step, right? Like maybe you hear about like the asteroid. Does it intrigue you enough to go find additional information elsewhere? And that's, I think, something that we don't know very, very much about. Like how do people then take this information that they've consumed really passively, and then like what do they do with it?
Well, and I think especially with the TikTok conversation, I'd like to put Phoebe and Sean on the spot a little bit, if that's okay. The recent data coming out of the November election, looking at age groups, shows that the 25 and under age group is the most polarized voting group that we have. Men went hugely for Donald Trump, high percentages. Women went hugely for Kamala Harris, which we don't see in other groups. There's always been a gender difference between Democrats and Republicans. Definitely with Trump, there's a huge gender gap that exists in almost all categories. But the one for 25 and under is monstrous. And and I'm sure the explanation is very complicated. I don't expect you to just explain it all away. But part of the explanation that I've heard is the echo chambers through TikTok especially of what people are hearing and the kinds of messages they're getting in terms of politics, and that men and women under 25 are getting hugely different information fed to them. And I don't know if you have any thoughts or data or feelings on that. And if you don't want to be put on the spot, that's okay.
And just to buy you more time to think about that, David Shore there was a Ezra Klein podcast, and he interviewed David Shore, and he cited survey research showing that people who consume TikTok became essentially like, I want to say 6 or 8 percentage points more conservative from 2020 to 2024. So there's data to show that, you know, and not to be conspiracy theory, but we had President Trump go from wanting to ban TikTok to then being like, oh, we want to keep TikTok around. It appears those who primarily get their content from TikTok became a little bit more conservative. Again, lots of reasons. So,
Yeah, so I'll go first here. I think for a while there was this general idea that Gen Z was going to be one of the most progressive generations, that they were going to have this huge positive impact on the world, and wherever you lie in the political spectrum, how Gen Z men voted, or men under 25, how women under 25 voted, it could be positive or negative voting, or excuse me, depending on how you think. But I think something that I have in my notes is that I think there are different people on the internet who have influence, who maybe speak to grievances that the person watching may have. And I think specifically with young men, with a lot of them feeling isolated, alone, ostracized, looking for a community, I think there was people that align with Donald Trump, people on the right side of the political spectrum who kind of saw that and capitalized on it. And I think that's where you see a lot of men under 25 swinging towards Donald Trump. So that's just my input on it.
Yeah, and kind of going along that, I think it's just a lot of, with TikTok, it's the more you like stuff, the more, it comes up on your For You page. And I think when it comes to women's health issues and that kind of stuff, if you like one thing, then you're going to get a lot of, Team Harris, 2024. So I think that that's a big part of it too. As to why there's such a big divide, that's kind of surprising to me too. And that TikTok could encourage that kind of divide. But I think it's also it's so personalized for you, and it's so individual that, I feel like, of course, we've been seeing, a lot more polarization. But yeah, I think that's interesting, though, that is the case, that's such a big difference. But I think it does have a lot to do with, what you're liking and all that kind of stuff, and picking, getting the candidate that aligns with that, I guess.
So we're down to just a few more minutes. I wanted to just check in again to see if there's any questions or comments that the audience may have. Yes, please, in the back. And I'm going to repeat the question for the group just so everybody can hear it. Oh, okay, so the question is, what do we think we can do to regain trust in the legacy media?
Okay. I think I may have a different opinion here than most. I don't know. I kind of wonder sometimes if trust in the media that's existed for decades, if we can ever gain that back. I think we have to really highlight and contribute to journalists who are on the ground and doing good work, who are doing something that Mrs. Couch likes to highlight a lot, original reporting. Legacy media as well. I feel like some of them have depending on which outlet you're going to, some of them have their own slants and biases as well. We really have to focus on people who are on the ground and doing original reporting, who are doing the good work, who are being the watchdogs that maybe traditional media, legacy media, that role, whoever you place the fault on, that role is maybe not theirs anymore.
Yeah, I mean, the fact is, good journalism is still happening. We started kind of by talking about the Chicago Sun-Times and as an example of a decline. But just last week, the Sun-Times, which had partnered with WBEZ, and was reporting, the headline was, "Chicago cops have been making fewer traffic stops, but more are ending in violence." And so from the story, Chicago cops pulled over fewer drivers last year as the fatal shooting of Dexter Reed sent shockwaves through the city and led to promises of reform. but far more of the traffic stops ended in violence. An investigation by the Chicago Sun-Times and the Investigative Project on Race and Equity has found. So they are doing the work that uncovers important stories like this, that, you know, holds people accountable. They are doing, fulfilling that watchdog role. And, you know, I wish I knew the answer to how we rebuild trust in legacy media. And it may not be about rebuilding trust in legacy media. It may be about finding the next thing. It may be about building the new thing. People still need good information. They still want information, I think, though there's some question as to that. Sometimes people just want to reinforce what they already think. But, you know, I think we still need reporters. We still need good journalists, and we still are going to have that in some form. It just may not be in the old form.
Yeah, I was just going to add on to that. I feel like there needs to be kind of a meet in the middle situation like you're talking about, where it's like, you know, these outlets maybe are switching to a new vehicle, such as podcasts or such as this new media. And I think that would be really important because they have all of this rhetoric set up against them and all this mistrust that has been already, you know, formulated. So I think that that would be really interesting to see how that goes and see how would people trust the media more if they came in, you know, a different vehicle such as podcasts and social media.
Yeah, it's actually an exciting time for journalism and an opportunity to reinvent, you know, with this new generation of smart young people, and to reinvent the ways that we get information out to people and the way that we consume it, and maybe bringing together some of the new media things with some of the legacy media things would be the way to go forward.
I've said, and Lisa, you and I have talked about this, there is an irony to me that the profession of journalism, I do think, is under attack. It's under pressure.
Yeah.
But the irony is the skills of our journalism classes are used across businesses in ways as never before, because every corporation, every company, every college is directly communicating outward to the world. So this is a commercial for Lisa's awesome classes. If you take journalism classes here, you are building skills, to me, that are the most employable skills that those skills have probably ever been, because you don't have to just go work for a newspaper. But also the odds of getting a journalism degree and getting into those exact journalism careers are more and more difficult than it would have been in the past, for sure. So the irony there. So take some journalism classes. They're really excellent.
Thank you.
Well, we are at our time limit. I want to thank all of you for being here, and thank you to Michelle, our interpreter. Thank you to our panel members. Please join me in thanking them for all their contributions today.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tara.
All right, how do I turn this thing off? Maybe I haven't been picked up. I don't know. Man, you guys were great. So good, so articulate, smart.